Hello, I'm Bob Bowman, Managing Editor of Supply Chain Brain, and I'm joined today in conversation with Rob Byrne. He is CEO of Terra Technology. Rob, welcome.
Thank you.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about what you do and how people use your solution?
Sure. So we offer demand sensing, typically used as a bolt-on or a replacement for demand prediction, generally reducing forecast error quite a bit. Inventory optimization, so setting inventory targets, and then typically those are used together as a platform with a traditional planning suite. And then transportation forecasting, which is relatively new, and with the idea of changing transportation and warehousing from largely reactionary to give people the ability to plan with a forward-looking view of capacity, demand, the way people have with finished goods.
Well, that has always been the dream, to get away from being reactionary, but are you saying that we have finally reached that point where that is in fact a reality?
Yes, and I think we have. So really at lane, mode, temperature class, carrier level, being able to predict really daily demand is currently a reality.
Even the idea of demand sensing feels to me like it's fairly new, and to the extent that we can actually do that, as opposed to it just being a dream of many years ago. Is there something about the technology now that makes demand sensing more effective and more capable of achieving its goals?
Yes, I mean certainly sort of the availability of retailer data in consumer products has driven it, but demand sensing is being used in other industries, chemicals, oil and gas. It's really, if you didn't know how forecasting worked, you would imagine it would work this way. So demand sensing is taking all of your demand signals, looking at how your customers behave, and then figuring out what they're likely to do next. I say it's a little bit like I'm going to buy milk for my family this week. The demand planning approach is to think about how much milk I bought in this week last year. The demand sensing approach is to look in the refrigerator.
And I would imagine that demand sensing helps you to offset that old adage that says the forecast is always wrong. Maybe this means it's a little less wrong as a result, right?
Yes. We do actually a benchmarking study every year, and we're averaging about 38% improvement. So pretty dramatically less wrong.
Okay. Tell me about working with clients. What makes a good client in your estimation?
I would say an appetite for innovation, a desire to be better. When you run into customers who have their way of doing it, they've done it this way forever, and they'd like to keep doing it that way, it's a barrier to improvement.
Do they come to you with the attitude that this is simply a piece of technology that they just want to bolt on and make work on day one? Or are they more cognizant of the need to integrate with other systems, to change business process, to adjust, to be more of in a collaborative mode with you? Which is more likely these days in terms of your dealing with clients?
I'd say it's sort of a 50-50. Some customers clearly have a problem, want it fixed right away. Some other customers are definitely more progressive, more interested in being out kind of the leading edge of what's capable.
And do you find yourself with the challenge of having to integrate to clients' existing systems? Is that ever a problem or any kind of a challenge at all?
So I'd say one of the things we've learned from implementation is people have less control over their data than they think they do, right? When you're doing a sort of invoice level forecasting optimization, you need very clean data. And that's, you're talking essentially transaction level data. And that's new for a lot of supply chain departments. Maybe they're working weekly for forecasting, right? It's not, so the granularity and the amount of data is really typically new.
So you certainly have racked up a lot of experience in this area so that you bring to the table a lot of lessons in implementation that you can advise the client on to make this work. What are some of the other things that you tell a client that needs to be done in order to make this particular engagement actually work?
So I'd say the data cleanliness and alignment is generally the biggest one, but after that there is some process change, and of course you need some discipline at the other end, because if you're not kind of following the forecast, then you don't get the results, right?
Yeah. Okay. The theme of this conference, of course, is the supply chain of the future. Mm-hmm. And what you deal with is the future, because by its very nature, demand planning is that. How do you interpret this whole idea of the supply chain of the future? How do you see that?
I really think that there's going to be a lot more automation and fewer planners. I can't say it's something I'm thrilled about, but you look at, computers are not smarter than people, but they are getting smarter. You're processing a lot more data to make a good decision, so you have sort of two, things pushing for more automation. At the same time, you have tremendous cost pressure in a lot of companies, headcount pressure, product proliferation, and there's still some fundamental problems that aren't well solved, but they could be. Like, is it easier to build a driverless car or to figure out how much inventory to ship from a plant to a warehouse? I'm going with the driverless car, right?
Yeah. So the point at which a human has to take over in the process, is that changing? Is it getting later and later and later in the process that the computers can do more?
It should be. I mean, it certainly is on the demand sensing end, so at the very start kind of the supply chain. I think you're going to see more of it on deployment and eventually on scheduling, right? I mean, people are writing algorithms to trade hundreds of millions of dollars worth of stocks automatically. I think we can solve some of these issues. It's an interesting thing. There has not been a tremendous amount of innovation in some ways in planning, but I think it's coming.
Because we hear about how automation can take you to a certain point. Automation can detect something that's out of tolerance. Mm-hmm. Human beings don't have to monitor everything all the time, but when something does become out of tolerance, the conventional wisdom has been then a person steps in to take care of it. Are we getting to the point where automation can extend to actually taking action in the event of something being out of tolerance from an automated perspective?
Yes. I don't think you're ever going to get away from, people at some level. The exceptions need to be managed, but there are certainly a lot of things that maybe historically would have been exceptions that software can really work its way around and come up with a plausible answer for.
Kind of an interesting irony, I guess, is that companies talk constantly about needing better people. They need better analytics and statistician experts, and yet at the same time, fewer of them. Is that the contradiction here almost?
Well, I think it's another sort of factor that's driving automation, right? The lack of supply chain talent. The opportunity is there for software vendors to produce better products and say, okay, you don't really need more people, right? Mm-hmm. You can do it with the existing staff. I mean, demand sensing, for example, we're publishing daily forecasts every day, say, for Procter & Gamble around the world, without review, because you can't possibly review forecasts every day, right? So having been a demand planning manager, that sounds like it's a very dangerous idea. I would never have let an old, traditional demand planning system just go ahead, publish the forecast, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. So much for the idea of artificial intelligence and expert systems that we thought were going to take over this human role and make all these great intelligent decisions that people no longer need to make. Not so much the case then?
I think it's a lot slower than I expected. I mean, I got out of business school in '84. I thought optimization was wonderful. Everyone would be using it, and 30 years later. But you do see some change.
Yeah, AI is always 10 years in the future, no matter when
right.
It is. Right?
So we're not getting any older, right?
Yeah, well, some people aren't, maybe. I want to know what you think about the phrase supply chain excellence, what that means to you personally. How would you define that?
I don't think you can define supply chain excellence really for a company. I really think it's kind of like marriage and a family. So, thick and thin, good times and bad. If your customers are happy, your suppliers are happy, and at the same time, you're meeting your own needs around profitability and performance, then it's a success. Do your customers stick with you? Do your suppliers stick with you? So to me, excellence is making that work, essentially.
I also wonder if it has something to do with knocking down silos within organizations and getting people to collaborate in a more general, ongoing way. I mean, do you find that to be a problem in your client base sometimes, that the client itself has failed to enact business processes that tear down some of those departmental silos?
Sure. I mean, S&OP or IBP, right? The classic, the elephant in the room is incentive conflict. Nobody wants to deal with the fact that not everyone is showing up to produce an accurate forecast. Some people are showing up to keep their marketing budget. Some people are showing up to make sure there's plenty of inventory in case anybody orders it. So examples like that, I would say yes. Although, when I started at Unilever in supply chain. I worked for the director of logistics who reported to the VP of manufacturing. Unilever now has a chief supply chain officer with about 60% of the company reporting to him, so supply chain has made some progress.
And so is demand planning. I imagine that the role of the demand planner in the organization has taken on an importance that just wasn't there before, correct?
It has, although the role itself has changed, I'd say less than it should have because the technology prior to demand sensing has changed less than it should have over the past, 30 years.
Yeah. There's also that dynamic that keeps shifting, the debate between whether a company should do a better job of forecasting or should do a better job of reacting to the world as it really is on the idea, again, that the forecast is always wrong and we're never going to get it right, so let's just be an agile organization. Let's forget about forecasting. That's a bit of an extreme statement, I would imagine, but where do you stand on that whole dynamic?
I think that ignoring information about the future is kind of silly. It is true. I mean, okay, fine. With demand planning, your average error for next week, 52%, that's not very good. But I would say being demand-driven really requires a better demand signal and, to the extent that you can, shortening your lead times, right? But to get to the point where I only look at, for example, my orders for tomorrow isn't really feasible. You have a promotion next week, you can't wait, to produce it, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's too extreme. I think you sort of passed the low point on the cost curve and you're headed back up the other side.
Could you put on your innovator's hat for a moment, your visionary hat, which as a CEO you're required to wear from time to time, I would imagine, and tell me what you think, how do you really see the supply chain of the future in a way that's completely different from anything we imagine now? Do you have any ideas about how things might radically transform in a way we can't foresee at this point in the next 5, 10 years and beyond?
So that's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, 3D printing, the driverless vehicles, all could do quite a bit, I think, there. But I really think the biggest change is going to be information flow and the systems. I think you will finally see, hopefully, true end-to-end optimization, shared inventory targets. I mean, too many companies are looking at end-to-end as from the warehouse back to the plant, right? And so we'll see.
Yeah. Are there any paradigms that we're all kind of stuck in right now, in your opinion, that we need to kind of shuck in order to meet the challenges of the supply chain of the future?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny because supply chain people tend to like technology, right? You want the latest iPhone, I mean, all this sort of stuff outside of what they're doing. But I would say, people process technology is really a problem for supply chain because the idea that you can design a process and then find technology to support it is really turned on its head lately. I mean, you have a ton of technology that is driving entirely different processes, whether it's driverless cars or drone deliveries or real-time traffic on your iPhone. I mean, 10 years ago, I carried a paper atlas, right? Then I had a GPS with a hard drive. Then I had a GPS with solid state. Now I have an iPhone with real-time traffic. Totally changes the process. Without looking at the technology is both, it informs the process and it dictates what processes are possible. So,
any final remarks or observations about this whole world of demand planning and where it's going and how you see it?
I'd say one of the most exciting developments is SAP discontinuing APO because it's really sort of stagnated innovation for quite a while, and it's caused people to rethink, well, what is planning? What should I be doing here? What's out there? So I find that actually tremendously exciting, that people are really looking at, again, what will I be doing 5 years from now?
That sounds like a real paradigm shift. Yeah. Rob, thank you so much for speaking with us today about this whole issue of demand planning and what you folks are doing at Terra Technology. Thanks very much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me in. It's always a pleasure.
I've been speaking with Rob Byrne of Terra Technology. Thank you very much for watching.